I am Craig Symonds, the author of World War II at Sea, A Global History, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and we're at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop's broadcast studio, and today's program is Stranger Than Fiction. You've been listening to Victory at Sea just to get you in the mode. It gives me goosebumps even today. I was 8 years old when my parents allowed me to stay up on a Sunday night to about 10:30 to watch Victory at Sea. And many of you, I know it, and certainly the music is known to most of us. If you're watching on Facebook Live or even the Author's Voice website, you can use the comments button to submit a question, and we invite it. Give us your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out and say hello. Positively, you can order a signed book or 17 of them. They're good gifts. And give them out. This is a terrific book, and a lot of people are interested in the naval aspect of World War II. So you're at authorsvoice.net, and that's where you can order it. And remember, next time you can order before the show begins even, and certainly if you're watching on YouTube afterward on the broadcast, you can order still. We'll have copies of first edition signed as well still. At least we hope so. We intend to have a lot of people buying this book. Well, we're going to have to get to this because I've got tons of questions because it's just a super duper book. And here's a book we're going to be having today. Craig Symonds taught history at the U.S. Naval Academy for 30 years, where he's now a professor emeritus. Currently, he's a visiting Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History for 2017 to 19 at the U.S. Naval War College. He's the author of 10 books on Navy and Civil War subjects, including Lincoln and His Admirals, which won the Lincoln Prize after appearing on our program, by the way.
Indeed.
And Neptune, the Allied Invasion of Europe and the D-Day Landings, which was winner of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature. And The Battle of Midway, the best book of the year, according to Military History Quarterly. And he's the 2015 recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature. So his latest book, World War II at Sea, A Global History. Oxford University Press, 792 fascinating pages, 108 images, 23 maps and charts, and cost $34.95. And will stay that way even if you're watching on YouTube afterwards. Craig, welcome to our show and broadcast again, and I'm glad you're here. So you have a blurb on here from Tom Hanks on the back of this thing I saw, which is kind of interesting. Just to say what this is, it's really a narrative of the entire war and all of its belligerents on all the world's oceans and the seas between 1939 and 1945. It's literally the first book to evaluate the impact of sea services from all nations on the trajectory and outcome of the war. So I read this as you suggested, considering all the oceans, all the water, as one large battlefield interrupted with islands of the continents, they're like islands.
Right.
So I read this, and I recommend you do the same thing, as one huge battlefield, all the seas and oceans around. Well, first of all, why do I like this book the most? Because I like any book that uses the word Brobdingnagian in a sentence. And secondly, I'm going to just say Samuel Eliot Morrison who? This is a good book. And I think this is one that everyone is going to want to have. There's way too many stories to cover everything in the book, but I'm going to cover things that I want to know about. And so tell us first, we were talking before we began, of the two contributions you feel that are that you're most proud of, I guess, besides the book, which you should be, one at Midway and one at D-Day.
Well, let me say a word or two about Samuel Eliot Morison first, if that's okay. I don't want to imply that this supersedes in any way what Samuel Eliot
No,
Morison
I'm
did.
implying that.
He had a 15-volume history of that war that's extraordinary detail, still reads fresh as the sea salt spray, and I continue to recommend that. But what Morison did was chronicle the United States Navy in World War II. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of in this book is to try to take this story of the United States Navy in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, in the Arctic, and the Royal Navy, and the Norwegian Navy, and the Polish Navy, and the Japanese Navy, and put all of them into a single story in a chronological format. That's hard to do because you don't want to be jumping about from ocean to ocean, day to day. So to make a single chronological story out of this great common. That's the phrase, by the way, that Alfred Thayer Mahan used to describe what you did about the oceans being a single battlefield. He called it the Great World Common. And all of those fleets participated in this war somewhere or another on that common, often simultaneously. And it's a complex, compelling, really rich story.
Oh, positively. But again, very quickly, the two contributions that you actually are making. One at Midway, you have an idea of what happened there.
Well, I did do books on both Midway and on DDay prior to doing this, and they informed a lot of the way I approached those two problems. I think the most controversial thing to come out of the Midway book was my conclusion that the air group from the USS Hornet had flown in the wrong direction. Now, this has been a controversial aspect of this battle for a long, long time, and people have discussed it and debated it. The squadron commanders did not submit, or if they submitted after-action reports, they were not forwarded because they have disappeared from the public record, a suspicious event in and of itself, so that Admiral Mitcher wrote the only after-action report that survives from the Hornet on that day, and Admiral Spruance, his boss, in writing his endorsement to that report, said something I have not seen on any other endorsement since the United States Navy was founded, and that is, where discrepancies exist between this report and other reports, the other report should be accepted as more accurate. Which led me to probe deeper and discover what most likely happened that day. And I think that story, which is in this book as well, is one of the contributions that I made.
And the other is on D-Day.
The other is on D-Day. D-Day is a very complex story in its own right, of course, and there are several elements here. I think the role of the LSTs, and I know you want to ask me about those later, both at D-Day and in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific, and again all simultaneously, have been emphasized. It's not that this is brand new. I'm not discovering this, but I think have not been emphasized to the point where it allows us to understand how critical the role of logistics was in the D-Day invasion. And in particular, the tendency we have had since 1944 to say that those artificial harbors off the British and American beaches in Normandy were the key to the logistic support of the operation, because what I discovered is that the LSTs really were the essential element of that, and that the mulberries, I think because we invested so heavily in them at the time, have created this impression that they were our secret key to the invasion of Europe, and I think that's been overstated.
I just want to go back to something you started out with, I think in your introduction, about this being the most prolific death rate of any war. And I immediately thought of Genghis Khan, strangely enough. And you say that the single greatest cataclysm of violence in human history, there were over 60 million deaths.
Conservatively, 60 million deaths.
Yeah, and Genghis Khan maybe also conservatively only 40 million deaths. But in World War II killed 3% of the world population, whereas Genghis Khan got 11%.
Okay.
So I'm just asking what your thought is on that.
That's an interesting way to put a spin on it. And I think, too, when you're counting deaths, the records are not so specific in many parts of the world. Deaths in what was then the Soviet Union, now Russia, we can estimate to a certain extent. And there, of course, are battle casualties, and there are also starvation deaths, civilian deaths. There are civilian deaths from the bombing on both sides, and deaths from starvation in Asia as well as in Europe. adding all those together, I won't dispute your 11% versus 3% number, but I will stick with my argument that it was the greatest cataclysm of violence in world history. Genghis Khan notwithstanding.
All right, I like it. Let's talk about some of the significant minds, naval minds, at the beginning and during World War II. Who were the most significant? You call Halsey, for instance, the Patton of the Navy.
Yeah, leadership in the Navy, and the United States Navy in particular. The United States Navy obviously plays a prominent role in the story. I mean, I mentioned how I tried to bring all of the navies in and show how it's all one great big story. Yeah. But the United States Navy is the greatest producer of weapons of war and one of the principal operational leaders, particularly in the Pacific. And if you try to look at the leadership within the United States Navy, they fall, I think, into two groups. And Halsey personifies one group. That's the guy who's kind of got the bit in his teeth. I mean, he was called Bull, you know. He never liked that, by the way, that he was called Bull. But he did seem to personify that. He was famous for asking what he was going to do in this war, and his answer was kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. Well, that's a personality type. And let's contrast that to his boss, Chester Nimitz, calm, cool, dispassionate, those pale gray eyes looking into your face as he waited for you to explain why you had done something wrong, never exploded into violence. And yet, his was the mastermind of that Pacific War. So you have two personality types that play out here. And I think the same is true in Europe as well, where Patton was one type and Eisenhower was another type. Mm-hmm. And it's a dichotomy that becomes visible in every theater of the war.
Well, two others, Karl Donitz on the German side, who was really a fanatic and went all the way through to the end because of his fanaticism, perhaps. Was he the most responsible for the German Navy's renaissance before and just coming up to World War II?
That's a great lead-in, Dan, but I'm going to say no, he really wasn't. The guy who was most responsible for that was Erich Raeder. Mm-hmm. Erich Raeder was the head of what the Germans called the Kriegsmarine, and the renaming of that force is interesting by itself. It was originally, the National Navy under the old Weimar Republic. But when Hitler took power and reconstituted the Navy and it began to grow again, its name was changed to the War Navy, Kriegsmarine. And Raeder, who had been at the head of that force for a long time, envisioned a Navy that would challenge the Royal Navy, much as Germany had tried to do in World War I, with battleships, battle cruisers. It was his idea to build a Bismarck and the Tirpitz, these oversized battleships that would dominate the seas, and the super battle cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. But Hitler began to see right away that in Hitler's view, this was sucking money away from the land war, and he was not happy with that. And he eventually put Raeder aside in favor of Karl Donitz. And Donitz was he was a fanatic, not only in terms of his love of the U-boat arm of the Navy, but his love of the Third Reich, and was Hitler's successor. Some people perhaps unaware of that.
But he pushed U-boats.
He's the one who pushed the U-boats early on. Yeah, from the beginning.
Was that the most potent vessel at the beginning of the war?
Oh, absolutely. 1939, only a couple of months, last few months of 1939 and through the first half of 1940 at least, perhaps all of 1940, the U-boat threat to the lines of supply that kept Britain in the war was very real. Churchill, in his post-war memoirs, wrote, "The only thing that would keep me away at night was the U-boat threat."
Well, what kept them from winning the war early on then?
Didn't have enough of them. Mm-hmm. Just did not have enough. And Donitz, frankly, blamed some of that on Erich Raeder. Raeder putting all that money in the Bismarck and the Tirpitz and all those other very expensive, very large ships, which arguably played very little role in the war. How many submarines might he have built? You know, he wrote to Hitler, Donitz I'm talking about now. Donitz wrote to Hitler and said, look, we won't be ready for a war until 1945 or 1946. Mm-hmm. But Hitler thought, oh, these Western, they're feckless, they gave way at Munich, they'll give way again, and didn't really believe it, so began the war in 1939, when Donitz had only about 52 submarines. Mm-hmm. Had he had the 300 submarines then that he claimed were necessary to fight an effective war in the North Atlantic, it's arguable that he could have shut Britain down, closed it off, and Britain would have been forced to surrender or starve.
And we would have been in the war at all then.
We were not even in the war yet.
Yeah, we may not have gotten in. I as a young guy, clearly remember the U-505 crossing Lakeshore Drive on the south side here for its permanent home in the Science and Industry Museum.
Right.
And it's still there. What a great
visit. Recommend it to everybody who has an opportunity
terrific.
to go aboard. Absolutely.
Now, another one that is in the naval aspect, let's get to the Pacific with Yamamoto. And was there any equivalent of Yamamoto in any of the other navies? Because he was really a force.
Well, the equivalency is difficult to deal with because Japanese culture so defines the roles that Japanese admirals could play and did play. Japanese culture is difficult to explain to Westerners because while the emperor was divine, he was therefore could not make a mistake, which meant that all the real decisions were made below his level and then presented to him so that he could bless them in effect. And the Army and the Navy in Japan were at daggers drawn with one another. I know we in the United States get all excited about Army, Navy, football and all that. That's nothing. These guys would kill each other, quite literally kill each other. Occasionally killed the Prime Minister as well if he wasn't doing the kinds of things they wanted him to do. So there's that dynamic between the Army and the Navy. And then even within the Japanese Navy, there's not only the General Staff, which has one view, there's also the Combined Fleet. That would be more or less like what our Chief of Naval Operations would be. And that was Yamamoto's job. He commanded the fleet, but he also had to deal with the General Staff. And they didn't always agree with one another. There was a lot of contention there. And so Yamamoto was very powerful in his influence, but he was not really absolutely powerful in command of decision-making. The decision to go to war with the United States he thought was a stupid decision. But he said, in effect, if you idiots are going to do this, there's only one chance we have, and that is to take out the American battle fleet on the first day. Absent that, we're doomed. We may be doomed anyway, but that's the only chance we've got. So he's often considered to be the father of Pearl Harbor, fairly, without necessarily appreciating the fact that this was not his number one idea.
Of course, the United States did go after him and it was a targeted assassination. Fascinating story, as you put it in here. But the problem, of course, was that they didn't want to reveal that they had broken the code.
Right.
So how did they finesse that?
Well, the whole idea that the United States, by 1942, middle of 1942, was reading enough of the Japanese operational code to get a sense of what they were doing. I want to emphasize that the code breaking was not that we were reading their mail, in real time, but we could break down just enough of it through this careful and difficult cryptanalytic project that was going on in Hawaii. And one of the messages that came across was an itinerary of Yamamoto's visit to the front lines in April of 1943, and we realized we have a chance to get him. But if we send a squadron out there to ambush him, are the Japanese, wait a minute, how did they know he was coming? Oh my gosh, they're breaking our code. We'll change the code and we would lose that invaluable asset. So there was a lot of concern about that. And the cover story was, well, a coast watcher, an Australian coast watcher, saw a flight of planes coming down reported it. That's what led to the dispatch of, and that story stood up. But they did shoot down Yamamoto's plane, a deliberate, targeted assassination, which is another ethical dilemma. I mean, millions die in war. But to pick out one individual and go kill him, is that different? And Nimitz decided that no, he's in uniform, he's fair game, we're going to get him.
Jefferson Davis thought that in the Civil War, that he was targeted.
Right. That may or may not be true too, but that's another one.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to ask about the ocean terrain.
Okay.
It's well known that terrain affects land battles, not to mention weather, of course. But what terrain features are there in the naval battles that affect it, maybe briefly, worldwide?
Wow, that's a huge question, Dan.
It's another book.
It's another book, maybe. Terrain is an interesting word to use. I mean, for submarines, of course, there is a subterranean terrain where there are places submarines really don't want to go because it's too shallow and they become in jeopardy, where they can't rest on the bottom because it's too deep and would crumple the hull. But in terms of surface geography, dealing among the islands of the South Pacific and the Southeast Pacific in particular, where you get radar returns off the islands so that ships could creep along the shore at night and thereby obscure their location because it was difficult to pick them up on radar. Radar, by the way, is a whole topic we should also investigate. But all
That's
that
my
had a factor.
19th page.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah. There's an interesting factoid in here that I like, that the Royal Navy's couture influenced all the navies around the world. Their dress, naval dress, was influenced by the Royal Navy. So besides couture, what were the commonalities of the naval theaters and the navies? Again, there's way too much in this book, but if we can get a little bit of a sense of what the reader is going to find in here, that would be interesting.
First of all, I'm going to tweak you a bit on your pronunciation of culture, the German pronunciation, that culture, as opposed to Western Anglo-American culture. The Royal Navy culture was so dominant. The Royal Navy in the 19th century and the early 20th century was so dominant, everybody wanted to be like the Royal Navy. The United States, the Japanese, the Russians, the Germans, the Italians, everybody. So the uniforms that are now virtually universal around the world, the double-breasted navy blue coat with the brass buttons, medals worn above the pocket, the combination cap with white cover, black bill. All of these characteristics that we think of as being naval now are essentially derivative of the Royal Navy, as are the ship types: battleships, battle cruisers, aircraft carriers, cruisers. All of these characteristic elements of what a 20th century Navy looked like and felt like, the watchstanding protocols, all of those things all came from the Royal Navy.
We have up on the screen right now a comparative of the Royal Navy, the ship silhouettes as they were entering the war. Did other navies, again, look to the British and see what was there and try to...
Well, they did to a certain extent. I mean, these were the ship types. This is from the 1930s. The book opens with a little window into attempts to disarm the navies in the 1930s at the London Naval Disarmament Conference of 1930. And so these are all ships from the 1930s. There at the top, the battleship, Nelson, is characteristic of the ship that everyone assumed was the Queen of War. And that's partly British. It's also partly American, because Alfred Thayer Mahan, then an American captain, subsequently a Rear Admiral, wrote a book published in 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, in which he argued that the dominant naval power could control the seas, which made them control trade, which allowed them access to money, and money was the coin of world power. So you put that syllogism together, and it implies that the nation with the most battleships, he never quite came out and said it this way, but it was certainly interpreted that way, the nation with the most battleships was the nation that would rule the world. So everybody wanted to be the dominant battleship navy, and that was still kind of the default paradigm when the war opened in 1939. But the other ship types, we saw the aircraft carrier there earlier, is going to emerge as the new Queen of War, although that doesn't really become clear until after the Battle of Midway in 1942.
Can you briefly, again, compare and contrast the knowledge and efficiency of the various navies, of the people who were on the ships? Some must have been more familiar with what they were doing than others.
Well, what happens in 1939, of course, the navies that exist are the professional navies. And the Royal Navy was the most professional navy. Being an island nation, Britain depended for its survival on dominating the seas around it, on keeping open the sea lines of communication that brought in the food, the fuel, the finished products that allowed her people to eat and to live and to heat their homes. Japan certainly falls into that category too. Japan, a fairly recent member of the modern industrial nation states, also depended heavily on its navy. But the nations that are going to emerge, and the United States in particular, has a relatively small navy. Now, they have a navy under construction. After France fell in 1940, the United States Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which authorized a navy larger than the entire Japanese navy that existed at the time in a single act. And it passed unanimously, 316 to nothing. You couldn't pass an act for Mother's Day unanimously in the Congress today. But they did, recognizing the danger. And so that's going to emerge. Now, getting back to your original question here, to man that navy meant a lot of people who had no background on the seas, very little training, maybe never seen the ocean, were now going to have to man these ships. Not only thousands, but tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of farm boys, bank clerks, soda jerks. these were all going to become the gunners, bosun mates, and engineers of the ships of the United States Navy that came out by the end of 1943. So in the one case, you have a couple of island nations with fairly sophisticated officer corps and enlisted force, but a sleeping giant awakened by Pearl Harbor that's going to overwhelm them both.
Now you conclude that World War II was won by the Allies because the British resolve in the initial years, the Russian Red Army, and Allied naval supremacy. Right. So, for all of Bill Malden's grunts and Curtis LeMay's flyboys and the scientists with technological breakthroughs and the American workers at home who produced the weapons of war, we have a chart from your book, The Losses That Came in the New Construction, how that came about. Please explain yourself.
Explain yourself, Dr. Symonds. Yeah, I think the first two are almost unarguable. That had Britain collapsed, as many expected it to do, many in the United States, many in Britain, in fact, expected, and of course it's Winston Churchill's indomitable determination that prevented that. But Britain's survival from June of 1940, when France falls, until June of 1941, when Hitler stupidly invades the Soviet Union, in that 12-month period, Britain alone held out against the might of the Axis powers, and Nazi Germany in particular. Absent that, the Allies don't have a platform from which to launch the invasion of Europe. They lose the lines of communication across the sea. It's utterly disastrous. Hard to imagine how the Allies would win, certainly by 1945, absent the British determination in that year. Second argument. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Second argument, the Russian army. Yeah. There is a tendency on the part of the United States, Americans today in particular, to underestimate. Oh, we're generally aware that, yes, the Russians played their role on the Eastern Front, but to underestimate the enormous sacrifice in blood and human life that the Russians expended, tying down the Wehrmacht, keeping 200 divisions of the German army. You know, when we invaded at Normandy, we invaded with 7 divisions, 5 land divisions and 2 airborne divisions. And we fought against 5 German divisions. You know, those numbers would grow. But when we did that, the Russians were fighting 212 German divisions on the front. So the sacrifice that the Russians made from 1941 to 1944 that allowed the United States and the Western Allies to build up their force for Phase 3 was critical. Now, the one you're really challenging me on is I argue, and it wasn't just Western Allied naval supremacy, it was American industrial supremacy. Airplanes and tanks and artillery and weaponry and shipping, all of which we produced in unprecedented and in fact previously unimaginable quantities. Once that American industrial capacity got geared up to full strength, it was just a steamroller. And that's the third element that ensured eventual Allied victory in World War II. And I'm sticking to it.
All right. I'll let you go this time, but next book we'll talk about that. Right. Scapa Flow is a good place to begin. That's where you began it. Did this set the tone for the whole book?
Well, I wanted to tell that story at the outset from the time I first conceived of this project, because it's it's mano a mano at sea a little bit. It's a German submarine sneaking into the heart of the Royal Navy at Scapa Flow, its major base there north of Scotland, and attacking and sinking a British battleship. It's a metaphor in so many ways. U-boats against battleships, Germans against Brits, the individual character of war at sea. I just thought it was a great place to start. And then I used that as a jumping off point to talk about the rebirth of the German Navy after Versailles and the interwar years. And of course, the continued commitment of the Western powers to the battleship. And again, I thought this was a suitable metaphor to start the book. But it is a great story.
And it really gave the mood of what was going to happen, because submarines had such a powerful impact all over the world. I just want to quickly also talk about the Norway campaign very early on. And to me, it was like a naval blitzkrieg. And even though, how did the world react to what was happening there? This is after Poland, and the way they reacted there was maybe different. But then, of course, the French were, the Germans were on the doorstep of France, and everyone was looking there too.
You know, it's interesting. This is a very important campaign, and one that a lot of Americans don't know very much about. There were no American forces involved. Norway was a long way away. It wasn't on the fighting front. But it was critical in a number of ways. It was potentially critical even in terms of atomic weaponry, because Norway was producing heavy water that the British were using for their experiments in atomic research and so on. So a number of what might have been get involved there. But another of the curiosities of the Norway campaign was that Winston Churchill, now returned as Prime Minister, has decided that it was important for the Allies to seize at least the port of Narvik in Norway, because it was in Narvik that the supplies came from Sweden, the iron ore from Sweden that was then transshipped to Germany down along the Norwegian coast, and he wanted to put a stop to that. And at the same time, coincidentally, and in fact unconnected to that, the Germans, our friend Eric Raeder, were planning to take control of Norway so they could use them as submarine bases. Both did it at the same time, neither of them knowing that the other was at sea. They collided with one another in this tragedy of errors in Norway. But again, it's an element of the war that, given the subsequent events of Normandy and D-Day and Midway and Leyte Gulf, that tends to get lost, but an important story nonetheless.
We have a number of questions that have come in. We appreciate that. And one I was going to ask about the Atlantic, which seems to really be a war on trade by U-boats. Oscar Anderson from Indianapolis asks, thank you, Oscar, for watching. When most people think about naval battles of World War II, the Pacific theater immediately comes to mind. But the naval battles in the Atlantic tend to be off people's radar. What is your experience, why that is, and what was that battle about?
Well, thank you, Oscar, and I think you're right about that. And one of the reasons is because we call this the Battle of the Atlantic, as if there were a battle and then somebody won and somebody lost and it was over. In fact, the struggle between convoys, Anglo-American convoys and German U-boats, that begins really in 1940, before the United States is even a belligerent, first from Canada, and then once the U.S. is in the war, mostly from New York, across to Glasgow and Liverpool, and then back again, and the supply of the Russians around the North Cape as well. Those combats against the U-boats were constant and unrelenting and unforgiving, and in terrible weather conditions and under the worst possible circumstances. And the losses were horrible. There were convoys of 40 ships that set out where 30 of them went to the bottom, but the other 10 got through. And absent that supply chain, it's possible, as I mentioned earlier, that Britain doesn't survive. So this is a critical battle, but it takes place at night, in bad weather, with escorts searching for U-boats and U-boats scurrying around on the surface and firing torpedoes and star shells in the air, and confusion about what's happening. And then the next day comes and the convoy plods on for another 14 hours before night falls again and it starts over. It's hard to chronicle. That doesn't stand up to the Battle of the Bulge or D-Day or Midway as an event, because it lasted so long. And yet, in terms of the strategic impact, it was essential. It was critical.
And it was continual. You know, Midway is here and Bulge is there, but this was continual. Right. What was the sub-activity, the German sub-activity around the shores of America? We probably don't know too much about that either, but how consequential was that?
Well, again, potentially very consequential, and even at the time, very significant. What happened is that Dönitz had, for a long time, pressured both Raeder and Hitler to allow his submarines to attack American escorts. Beginning in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt began authorizing U.S. Navy warships to escort British convoys. Now, that's a violation of the neutrality laws and all sorts of other things, but again, he felt the survival of Britain was essential. And Dönitz wanted to be able to attack those, and Hitler wouldn't let him do it. But then after Pearl Harbor, Hitler says, you know what, the wraps are off, go get them. So Dönitz sent 9 long-range submarines to the American coast, and particularly that bight of land around North Carolina, around Cape Hatteras, where the tankers from the East Texas and Louisiana oil fields were carrying the oil to New Jersey and New York ports, where it would be refined and turned into aviation fuel and so forth. And that was the bottleneck where his submarines set up. And the Americans thought, well, we're at war, we're bound to win this, and so on, but they kept their peacetime lights on. I mean, the German subs off the coast, they could read the hotel vacancy signs on the beach resorts while they were waiting for the tankers to come by. So it's a measure of, I think, the naivete of Americans early on in this war before they appreciated what was really afoot. And for a while, it was devastating. I mean, much of the tanker fleet was destroyed in those first few months. Once the convoys began to get better protection, and there was a big controversy about how to do this. But Admiral King, who was the United States Chief of Naval Operations, said, you know, you put all the convoys together, all the tankers together in a convoy, and what that does is make a target-rich environment for the U-boats. So we don't want to do that. And there were other factors as well, and we can talk about it more if you want to. But eventually, once convoys were established, the sinkings went down. The U-boats moved south into the Caribbean and began to destroy the tanker fleet there.
Well, the vacancy signs, I mean, the Hessians in the Revolution would have taken advantage of it, but I guess the U-boats didn't come ashore and use them, right?
Did not come ashore. No, that's not where their strength is.
Let me ask a larger question. What were the basic attack formations in the navies, just generally? What was the basic tactical formations that were used by various combatants? The Japanese used something called the anvil.
Yeah, that's not really an attack formation. The anvil is, well, first of all, let's shift gears a little to talk about combat in the Pacific, which is very different from combat in the Atlantic, in that large surface fleets composed of aircraft carriers, protected by a circular screen of cruisers and destroyers, and the occasional battleship after 1943 to protect it from anti-air attack and submarine attack, would launch their planes from 150 or as far as 200 miles away. So in the Coral Sea, for example, in May of 1942, two fleets fought a major naval engagement that never came within sight of one another. So the use of airplanes changed dramatically the combat formation. In the age of the battleship, you wanted the ships to be maneuvering in a line-ahead formation, essentially follow the leader, because now all the guns could be used, and you wanted to do what was called crossing the T. I'm going to make a little gesture here. If your fleet can go across the bow of the enemy's fleet, then all of your guns can be brought to bear against the enemy, and only their forward guns can be deployed. So this element of crossing the T with gunfire was the dominant view in the interwar years. But now that carrier emerges as the major combatant, a circular screen protecting that air base, that mobile air base at sea, that became the principal formation. The anvil attack was the Japanese really perfected this in the interwar years, and the Americans copied it subsequently, was that you would have torpedo bombers who would come from two different directions. I don't know if the viewers, they always say about pilots, they talk with their hands, right? Because here they have airplanes flying. If you come from two different directions off the starboard bow and the port bow at the same time, the maneuvering ship can't you might get out of the way of one of them, but you can't get out of the way of both of them. So if you launch an anvil attack, which is harder to do than it sounds, it puts that ship in dire jeopardy, and the Japanese were very successful at doing this in 1942.
What about submarine versus destroyer? How was that battle in Atlantic, Pacific? Who had the advantage, and did that change, and what was that like?
In general, I would say the destroyer had the advantage. It can't submerge, so there's a disadvantage. It doesn't want to submerge, right? But the destroyer is much faster. A submarine could go 16, 17 knots on the surface, only about 6, 7 knots submerged, and not for very long. The destroyer then could maneuver swiftly, could get out of the way of a torpedo often. It had early on depth charges, and then later on, when the forward-throwing Hedgehog weapon was invented and deployed, could attack in a number of ways. And of course, the emergence of what the British called ASDIC and the Americans called sonar allowed them to track even a submerged submarine. So in a duel, and there have been several very good novels about duels between a single submarine and a single destroyer as to who would defeat who. So it's a very good question, but I think on the whole, I'd rather be on the destroyer than in the submarine.
was there naval coordination around the globe? Maybe a feint here so an attack could go there, or a two-front attack? Did they coordinate in different seas, in different battle areas?
They did, but often inadvertently. And what's interesting about that is early on, the strategy of the Anglo-Americans, the British and the Americans got together at a number of conferences and talked to one another. What will we do if the United States gets into this war? And the primary decision they made was the decision that they would concentrate on Germany first. No matter what happened, Germany is a primary enemy. We want to fight these wars one at a time. First the Germans, then the Japanese. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, emotionally the Americans, of course, were inclined to go after the Japanese first, but the principle still stood. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, it was not executed that way because the war was constant all the time, everywhere. So the coordination that existed was one forced on the Allies by logistics. We only have so many ships, particularly transport ships, not so much battleships and carriers, although that too. We only have so many ships to go around, and we absolutely have to have a minimum amount here, so therefore we must have some there, and that compelled coordination as to where do you put your resources. That was the key.
There's so many interesting small stories.
Indeed.
In World War II and in your book. Here's one that's one of my favorites, The Man Who Never Was. I have in my collection both the English, the British, and the American versions. Give us a quick overview. This is a wonderful, and I think there was a movie on this.
There was. They did make a movie out of it. It takes place in over Mediterranean strategy. The idea is, where are the Allies going to go next? There was a big argument, which we haven't touched on yet, about when to invade in Europe. The Americans eager to go as soon as possible, the British not so fast. We've already been there. Dunkirk was no fun. So they go to North Africa first, then they move into Sicily, and then the question was, where would, actually North Africa, this is before Sicily, into North Africa, where are the Allies likely to strike next? Well, our intention was to go to Sicily. But we wanted to keep the Germans guessing, and there was a lot of disinformation campaigns, some that took place in Britain about D-Day. Many of our viewers may know about that. But this one involved whether we were going to go to Sicily or Sardinia. So one of the ways the Allies tried to misdirect the Germans was they got a cadaver, gave him official identification as Major, I've forgotten his name now, Major, let's call him Wilson, with a briefcase that was handcuffed to his wrist that contained a certain number of false official-looking documents implying an Allied plan to invade Sardinia. And then they threw it off a ship off the coast of Spain and let it drift ashore. The Spanish found it. Franco's Spaniards were sympathetic with the Axis. They examined the contents of the briefcase, copied them, made them available to the Germans, went all the way to Hitler's desk. Hitler bought it hook, line, and sinker. He absolutely believed this was the true thing and made sure that Sardinia was well guarded, and when we landed in Sicily, as a result, there was perhaps less active defense than might have been there otherwise. So, but it's an example, I think, of a broader campaign, Operation Fortitude, that the British in particular conducted to misdirect the Germans as to what was coming next.
His name was Martin.
Thank you.
And, but Tom Hanks will be happy that you said Wilson. It goes back to Castaway. That's very good.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to show, it just happened to have this, I'm going to try to show it so you can actually see it, a John Hancock document signed in 1776 commissioning the commander, John Nicholson, of the Hornet, the original Hornet. And why I'm bringing that up, because we've had 7 Hornets in American history. This one, the first one, was actually captured by the British right off the bat and recommissioned. There was a famous one, of course, during 1812, but there was a famous one in World War II. Doolittle went off the Hornet. And so what was the Hornet's role? Every ship had its own. What was the Hornet's role? And certainly in Operation Torch, it wasn't a good one.
Well, this particular Hornet, USS Hornet aircraft carrier, was commissioned in Norfolk in 1942, and its initial voyage went down through the Panama Canal, where it barely fit, designed to fit through the Panama Canal, then up to San Francisco Bay Area at Alameda, where it was loaded with 16 B-26 Mitchell bombers. And it was the one chosen for this exploit because being brand new, it was coming from the States. Once you put those bombers on it, now it could not operate as a conventional carrier. It had no fighter cover because the bombers took up the entire space. They wouldn't fit down the elevators to the hangar deck, so they just sat there. So the Hornet became particularly vulnerable. So when it got to the mid-Pacific, it was joined by the Enterprise, which provided the air cover for it as they transited the Western Pacific and launched that famous 30 seconds over Tokyo, about which many books and movies have been made. That was, quite frankly, mostly a public relations stunt. It did very little damage to the Japanese, but it made Americans feel good. By golly, they had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now you'll feel the sting of our bombers, too. All of the planes were lost. Most of the crews, however, got safely back. A handful of them were found and tried and executed by the Japanese, but most of them got back eventually to the United States through the help of friendly Chinese folks who found them on the coast.
We're showing a photograph of the Hornet being dive bombed, and that's the crucial one right there.
Yeah.
Fascinating image that is in your book.
Yeah. This is out of my book, and I wanted to use this one because the kamikazes are later going to play a major role. This is actually before the kamikazes became a protocol of the Japanese Imperial Navy. This is a wounded Japanese Zero, which you can see directly above the superstructure on the Hornet. He's been crippled, and he thought to himself, I can't get back anyway. I might as well spend my life for some reason, and dive bombed directly onto the Hornet. So,
you know, the merchant ships, it must have been harrowing to be on the merchant ships with 40 went out and 30 didn't come, make it. Yeah. But let's talk a bit about that sub-hunting period and human behavior and decency. And we talked briefly about ethics. You quote General George Kenny, "The Japanese ask no quarter and expects none." One crewman you quote said, "We did what we thought we had to do." Some had argued that submarine hunting of unarmed and lightly armed merchant ships should have been illegal in wartime. But then we were doing wholesale bombing of cities. So what's the difference of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I included in my book a particular confrontation. Dudley Mush Morton, a lot of these sub-skippers had nicknames by which they're more widely known. Mush Morton, one of the great successes in the American submarine campaign against the Japanese. Mush Morton sank an entire convoy of Japanese ships and then submerged and then came up, and the only thing left afloat were about 20 lifeboats filled with Japanese soldiers. And he gave the order, "Man the guns." And his executive officer, Richard H. O'Kane, who later became a famous submarine commander in his own right, questioned him about it. He says, "Skipper, we can't do that. They're in lifeboats. They're survivors. We can't shoot them." And he said, "Let me explain something to you, Dick." He said, the Air Force area bombs cities in order to get a factory. Now, without harming any civilians or any homes, I'm going to take out a Japanese division that, if it gets to shore, will kill Americans. So this is perfectly legitimate use of our weapons, and they just wiped them all out.
So atrocities escalated because of this, did it?
Well, I think this was happening on both sides. It's not that Morton said, "Well, they do it to us." He said, "This is a legitimate exercise of power in war. That's questionable and worthy of discussion." But the Japanese did the same thing. And of course, in the Battle of the Atlantic, when the German U-boats would sink a merchant ship, they didn't stop and pick up the survivors. Early on, by the way, they did. Early in 1940, German U-boats would sink a ship. The lifeboats would be, and they'd go up to the lifeboats and say, "Are you okay? Do you have enough water? Land is that way." And they'd try to be helpful. But by 1942, and certainly by 1943, no holds barred.
There was a New York Times op-ed just 2 days ago, and which was calling upon Silicon Valley to help the Pentagon with technology. Now, this goes back also, it goes back before this, I'm sure, but certainly in World War II with the atomic bomb here in Chicago or in Los Alamos, that they knew that they were producing something that could be used devastatingly in war, and there are numbers of scientists that didn't want to do that. But here we are today, saying, Silicon Valley, you have to help as well with war, because war is a technological incubator and it goes both ways.
War and technology. Yeah. War is a spur to technology as well as a beneficiary of technology. The radar was known about before the war in 1937-38, but not widely used until the war came. Radar allows you to see in the dark, to see in the fog, to pinpoint, target your enemies when they can't see you. Is that fair? Is that a legitimate use of technology? New weapon systems, guided bombs emerge in World War II, the V-1, the V-2, for example, among many others. So technology is going to play a role in war. Those who try to win the war want to use the best technology, particularly if your opponent has that technology. I happen to see that editorial as well, and the argument that, Google has this phrase, do no evil. Well, are we doing evil by making technology available to American armed forces? Well, our opponents, our potential opponents, are using that technology. Aren't you encouraging evil by not allowing us to have countermeasures to that technology? So the interrelationship of technology and war, I think, is inevitable, which was the point the editorialist was making, and I think that's probably accurate. Certainly true in World War II.
We got a question from Larry Damar from Michigan, and we may have touched on this already, but what was the coordination of the navies like on the Allied Axis side? Did it get better or worse as it went on?
It's interesting. In the Pacific early on, when the Japanese were absolutely having their way with us because they had prepared for this war and were strong in the Western Pacific in ways that we were not, there was a great effort to combine Allied forces into a single entity called ABDA. American, British, Dutch, and Australian navies all combined under a single command. A British general, in fact, commanded that. It lasted about a month and a half. Not because it was a bad idea to have coordinated strategy, but because the Japanese were simply too strong in that venue. After that, the British kind of said, well, you know what, you Americans, you can pretty much run the Pacific War. And the Anglo-Americans together ran the Atlantic War. And that consisted mostly in trying to decide when and where the Western allies, the Anglo-Americans, would go ashore in Europe. The Americans kept saying, let's go right now. Americans, by the way, are not a patient people by instinct. If we decide it's Germany first, we want to go there today. But the British, having fought on the Western Front far longer than we did in the First World War, and of course having already been chased off the continent at Dunkirk, said, we should not be in a hurry to do this until we know it's going to be successful. So there was this pull and tug back and forth between the Americans and the British about when and where that operation should go. And it was Churchill who kind of pushed the alliance into the Mediterranean, first in North Africa, then into Sicily, then into Italy, until finally the Americans, and particularly George C. Marshall, the American Chief of Staff, said, that's it. We've had it with you guys. We're going into Normandy. Let's go. And they did.
Well, the question I think most of our viewers are really wondering from you, what in your estimation were the best naval films depicting naval battles? Now, Das Boot, certainly on the submarine side, is that a good depiction? U-571, Hunt for Red October is certainly exciting.
Well, that's not World War II, of course, but...
No, but one ping only, Vasily, I like that. But Das Boot and U-571, and what naval battles on the surface do you also like?
As World War II movies go, I really love the Caine Mutiny. And the Caine Mutiny is about a little nothing of a ship, a destroyer/minesweeper. These were the workhorses of the fleet. They did escort duty. They did target towing. You see it in the movie. They're not the battleships, the carriers. They're not the ships that make the headlines and that win very many medals. But without them, the war could not have been carried out. And I liken also the way that film and the book on which it's based pair off the full-time career naval officer, Captain Philip Queeg, played by Humphrey Bogart so effectively, versus the Princeton graduate, show up for the war, get 10 weeks of training, and off you go to sea. Both were essential to make this war work, but there's a tension there too, and it's so evident in this film. I think that's one of my favorite all-time World War II movies, all-time movies, period.
FDR had been an assistant secretary of the Navy before becoming commander-in-chief.
Right.
How did that affect operations? He must have had ideas of his own.
He did. It's funny because George C. Marshall, whom I just mentioned a minute ago, who doesn't get enough credit for being the major architect of American strategy and Allied victory in World War II. George C. Marshall told him once, or possibly apocryphally, but it's such a good story, I'm going to tell it anyway. He said, Mr. President, I know you favor the Navy, and I don't mind that, but it does bother you when you refer to the Navy as us and the Army as them. So yeah, he was very much a Navy guy, really from boyhood. If you visit his Hyde Park home, the walls are covered with depictions of battles from the War of 1812. He read his Uncle Ted's, Cousin Ted's history of the War of 1812 when he was a boy. He even worked his way through Mahan's tome in 1890. So he was very much a Navy man, and I think his support for the Two-Ocean Navy Act in 1940, his support for the construction acts that led to the tremendous expansion of the American merchant marine fleet in the early days, not only of the war, but in the months before American entry into the war, were crucial in making sure the United States had the wherewithal to stand up, first of all, when the war began, and then eventually to win it. So that was important. He did not, however, involve himself operationally in decision-making. He knew better than that.
Well, of course, he made a very well-known historic move to Hawaii on a battleship on board the USS Baltimore. And we have a photo, I think, Matt, of him on there, I hope. We may not. But in it, he's smiling, but
yeah.
Nimitz and MacArthur were not.
Right.
And how did they decide on that battleship whom to attack and how the chain of command was going to be worked out?
Yeah, actually FDR loved going to sea. He did it a lot. Among his favorite ships were the Houston, one of the ships that was lost against the Japanese in the Battle of the Sunda Straits. And he would go to sea for months at a time. You think about a president of the United States in the 20th century saying, I'm going on a cruise, goodbye, and be gone for not weeks, but months at a time. Getting on the USS Baltimore, which was actually a heavy cruiser, not a battleship, but taking the Baltimore all the way out to Pearl Harbor to meet with his commanders. You know, they could fly to see him, but he liked being at sea. He really enjoyed being away from the White House, being away from the telegraph, being away from job hunters, perhaps. And that photograph, and I'm sorry we don't have one to show, but it is in the book, so you can see it there. He's sitting on the foredeck of the Baltimore, and he's got this enormous campaign smile on his face. And sitting on opposite sides of him are Nimitz, who commands not only the Pacific Fleet, but the Pacific Ocean area, and MacArthur, the Army commander who commands the Southwest Pacific, who have somewhat different ideas about where the emphasis should be placed in the Pacific War. And they both have these grim expressions on their face like, yeah, whatever. And he was the glue that held them together.
Another question I have
Yeah.
is for people today. I think viewers will be interested in this. What naval museums today do you like the best? I like, of course, the Yorktown in Charleston Harbor and the Intrepid in New York City. Those are great museums. What naval museums?
They're ship museums and absolutely not to be missed, without a doubt. I'll pick two others that are not at sea particularly. There's the one in New Orleans, the National Museum of World War II, that has a lot of smaller ships and airplanes, but also their displays are beautifully done, and they have a great archive. And one of the reasons I'm giving them a plug here is I did a lot of research in their marvelous archive, the Eisenhower Center. And the other one is in, of all places, Fredericksburg, Texas. It began many, many years ago. Fredericksburg, Texas is the place Chester Nimitz was born. And his parents ran a hotel there, and the hotel became a small museum dedicated to Nimitz himself. But then, in the last couple of decades, it's enormously expanded. And if some of you have been to the Little Museum, what was then the Little Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, and think that's it, that's not it anymore. There's a wonderful, wonderful display there. The National Museum of the Pacific War is the official name, and it's worth a visit. And it's just a tremendous facility.
Since you're in a Civil War bookshop, and we do have people who are multi-historian, what famous Civil War descendants? Were there a few descendants from Civil War people who fought in World War II that were sons and grandsons that made a mark?
Of course, many, because such a large percentage of the American population served in the American Civil War, and particularly those who, as a family tradition, went into military service. And even those who didn't have a family tradition ended up in uniform, many of them in World War II, because 16 million Americans eventually went into the Army. I guess maybe the most famous is Simon Bolivar Buckner, who commanded the United States forces on Okinawa. Not all that successfully, sadly to say, but of course his, I want to say grandfather, am I correct in saying that? Who was had the unhappy responsibility of having to surrender the river forts in 1862 to Ulysses S. Grant. And now his grandson is the one who presides over the American victory in Okinawa. So, but there are far too many, really, to name them all.
Sure. There are contrasting battles and operations that you have that does make this worldwide. For instance, 2 naval evacuations that you speak of are kind of interesting. One is you compare Dunkirk and Operation Hannibal at the end of the war, and the Germans even tried to save Hindenburg's coffin in the last one.
They did.
What can you say about those
Dunkirk
two?
is something most people know about. And of course, it's a great movie, by the way, out recently, Darkest Hour, and then, of course, Dunkirk. Both of those focused on those dark days when Dunkirk dominated the headlines. And as a result of that, Western readers often overlook the fact that the Germans confronted something very similar when the Russians were advancing along the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, and the German, not only soldiers, but tens of thousands of civilians were trapped there, and they believed, and not without cause, that they were in mortal danger if the Red Army got a hold of them. And so they all wanted to be evacuated into the Baltic, and they crowded aboard these ships and went out to sea, and some of those ships were lost. In fact, the biggest maritime disaster in history, the Wilhelm Gustloff, went down with a loss of 10,000, overcrowded with 10,000 refugees in the Baltic Sea in terrible weather. Baltic's never a very happy sea anyway in terms of weather, but this was in February, so it was particularly unhappy. So that was kind of the German Dunkirk, their evacuation of forces and civilians from the path of the advancing Red Army in 1945.
Did the coffin survive?
The coffin, I do not know. It was on the Gustloff. I don't know if they pulled that out from I'm going to have to look that up now. See, Dan, you shouldn't ask me these questions.
I had to find some chink in the armor somewhere, for heaven's sakes. We said we were going to talk a little bit about LSTs, and nothing showed off the LST better than Saving Private Ryan. And what that must have been like to when on the first wave or even subsequent, but the first wave and that opens up and you're right there. Did they draw lots to be there? I mean, that was almost suicidal.
No, they didn't draw lots. And let's make a distinction between the LSTs and the Higgins boats. The LSTs were the big ones, 309 feet long, very large ocean-going vessels. The sailors who manned them joked with gallows humor that LST actually stood for Large Slow Target because they were big, they were slow, maximum speed supposedly of 10 knots, but that's on a good day with a tailwind. And obviously targets because you cannot conduct an amphibious operation without them. They're essential. And operations all over the world, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, and of course, most famously perhaps at D-Day. And then hanging on davits off the sides of the LSTs are these much smaller Higgins boats. And these are the ones that Tom Hanks and his command were lowered down into the sea, climbed down the rat line, got into the boats, circled for 4, 5, 6 hours in choppy weather off the beach, and then another 4 hours in getting to the beach. So after crossing the English Channel, bobbing around in this horrible craft, throwing up on your boot tops, seasick as you can't believe, having foregone sleep or food for about 24 hours, because remember the invasion was delayed for a day because of weather, and then finally they get to that beach and that bow front ramp drops and the machine guns just start chewing up your command. It's horrible, and it was captured so well in that Spielberg film. He did a super job. My friend, the late Stephen Ambrose, was one of the ones who saw the film in early cuts and told me that after the first 20 minutes they had to stop the film. He couldn't
take it anymore.
Well,
how did the invasions of North Africa and of Sicily inform the later operation of Normandy?
Yeah, and that worked both ways. When we talk about this being a global war that is supposed to be Germany first, but ends up being kind of everybody all the time because we have to, there's a competition for these LSTs. You know, you need them to invade Sicily, but you also need them to invade Guadalcanal. Well, not Guadalcanal because that came early, but Tarawa and Kwajalein and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so there's competition for them to go in both directions, but there's also a learning experience, except that the lessons can't be applied perfectly, and here's why. When the Allies would surround a Japanese island, let's pick Iwo Jima, and bombard it from the sea for 10, 20, 30 days, and bombard it from the air for an equal length of time to prepare the beach for the landings, that made sense to the Marines who had to go ashore. But you couldn't do that at Normandy, because if you bombard that beach for 20 days, the Germans are going to go, aha, we know where the invasion is coming ashore. And so what happened instead is there was a very short bombardment at Normandy. And I've often been asked, well, you know, they knew that a short bombardment would not take out hardened sites. Didn't they know that from the Pacific? And the answer is yes, they did. But of course, at the same time, they also knew that the circumstances were different. So there was both competition for resources between and among the various theaters, and lessons learned. Staff officers went from one theater to another to bring back lessons learned in this operation to apply to that operation. But because conditions were often different, it wasn't a perfect match.
You know, we're not getting into the Italian Navy and the
Why
French
not?
Navy because
It's
we
in
only
the
have
book.
exactly it. It's in the book. I do want to ask about Omaha
Okay.
Beach, because why was the Allied bombing done so poorly there where it was done better later, and how did the Navy win Omaha?
Well, the aerial bombardment of Omaha Beach, like the naval bombardment of Omaha Beach, was saved for the last minute. They didn't take off from their airfields until the ships were already at sea because, again, they didn't want to tip their hand. You concentrate your bombardment on a particular beach and the Germans go, aha, we've got the information. And then, of course, you've got five invasion beaches that you have to hit. So you have to direct your planes to come in from different vectors. One coming in high, one coming in low, one coming in perpendicular, one coming in horizontal, and so on. So at Omaha Beach, the planes were coming in perpendicular to the beach. And knowing that the Higgins boats were already headed for the surf line, they didn't want to drop early. The cloud cover is very bad because remember the weather is iffy. They had postponed the invasion for 24 hours in any event, but the cloud cover is still there. So they had it calculated where to drop, but they didn't want to drop early because they'd hit their own men, so they dropped just a few seconds late just to be sure, so most of the bombs from the airdrop fell well inland, blowing up cows and pastures and so forth, but didn't really take out the German site, so that when the soldiers hit the beach, and these are Army soldiers, not Marines, when the Army soldiers hit the beach on Omaha, they found themselves in a crossfire of machine guns from hardened sites that were still intact. And then you ask about the Navy's role in this. Well, the Navy did have that preliminary bombardment, but it too was short, and it did not take out the hardened sites. Some of those sites were 13 inches of reinforced concrete, so you had to hit them with a direct hit. You know, area fragmentation fire would not do it. So when the soldiers got to the beach and found themselves pinned down, an emergency call went out to the Navy destroyers, both British and American, mostly American, but some British as well, who closed onto the beach, and this was not part of the plan, but it was improvised on the moment, and with targeted fire, cooperated with the soldiers on the beach to take out those hardened sites one at a time with 5-inch shells rather than the big 15-inch shells from the battleships. And that allowed the soldiers to get up off the beach and advance inland. So that cooperation between particularly the smaller craft, the destroyers, and the soldiers on the beach, improvised in the moment, allowed Omaha Beach to survive.
Today, I got an email from one of my colleagues
Okay.
that who is selling an interesting letter, post-war letter. And I want to read you a portion of this.
Okay.
This is from Admiral Nimitz.
Oh,
And it's,
I've heard of him.
Exactly. And in Berkeley, California, June 22nd of 1958, he wrote in this letter, "One frequently hears or reads that war is too important to be left to generals and admirals. But I have yet to hear that a questioning finger has been pointed to the politicians whose ability to plan a place or even the political objectives in the war is subject to grave doubt. It seems to me that in World War I and II, the generals and admirals did a better job in overcoming the enemy's will to resist than the politicians did in planning the objectives and the peace.
Well, that's interesting. He's being a little bit defensive there. And what's interesting about that is Nimitz is one of those, and we mentioned this at the very beginning of our conversation. He's one of those individuals who has a political dimension to his strategic decision-making. That is to say, unlike Halsey, he doesn't take the bit in his teeth and charge the enemy and try to kill Japs. What he tries to do is almost a political approach. What is the objective? How can we best achieve it? What resources are necessary? What has to be coordinated to make this possible? Those are almost political skills that he's deploying. And Eisenhower's great strength as a military commander. Eisenhower, I don't know if you know this, never commanded troops in battle his whole life. Never did. He was a tank trainer in World War I. He was on the planning staff of George C. Marshall at the beginning of World War II, and then he became commander of major operations, but he never led troops in battle. But he had that overall strategic view that allowed him to be essentially a political organizer, manipulator, and logistician for major operations. He was exactly the right guy to have in that role. And I will disagree with Chester Nimitz in this respect. I don't think you can say that about the World War I generals. I don't think they demonstrated more political skill than the decision makers in London and Paris and elsewhere. That was a horrendous war. I don't know, I'm not going to say what decisions they ought to have made, but the decisions they did make were pretty frightening. But I do think there's something to be said about what he says about World War II. Remember, this is a coalition war. You've got the Russians who have their political objectives, the British who have their political objectives, and they're different. The British want to survive to preserve the empire, to keep India as part of that imperial. Roosevelt doesn't care about the British Empire. He thinks national self-determination is what we should be fighting for. The Russians want a buffer security area for themselves in Europe and to make sure Germany never has a chance to invade them again. So you've got three allies, quotation marks around allies, who are cooperating with divergent national security goals. So they do a better job, arguably, of exercising effective command at the battlefront than did perhaps the post-war decision-making, in which nobody quite got all of the political objectives he sought. And Roosevelt, I think, saw this coming and did, I think, a wonderful job in trying to manipulate the big three in ways that would allow the Russians to get some and the British to get some and the Americans to get some and hold that alliance together long enough to win the war. But of course, Roosevelt was also a dying man in 1945 and did in fact die, literally at the moment of victory. And since we're in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, let me just say there's nothing like dying at the moment of victory to ensure immortality.
That's right. Although I don't see a Dwight D. Eisenhower bookshop.
Well, he lived beyond the moment of victory, so that's anyway.
Or FDR is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Now, coming up on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world, let me tell you what's coming up. On Thursday, May 10th at 3:30 p.m., this is Central Time, May 10th, Thursday, Berta's Books with Roberta Rubin, and she's going to have Julia Claiborne Johnson with her new novel, To Be Frank with Me. Roberta curates her show and finds the best authors she wants to have herself to be with her. So this is an important novel, I think, as well, that you'll want to be listening to. Thursday, May 17th, we actually have 3 shows. This is Thursday, May 17th. At noon, our mystery show called Solved. Libby Hellman will interview Brian Freeman with his latest thriller, Alter Ego. At 3:30 p.m., with Novel Conversations, a new show, I'm going to see Representative Steve Israel, who will be in town with his latest novel, Big Guns. This is a political novel that has humor and political interest of today, as well as being a good read. At 5:30 p.m., again, May 17th, A House Divided with Bjorn Skaptason will host Richard Quest with I Held Lincoln. So May 17th, I hope you'll be here for all 3 of those. Before, during, or after the show, you can ask questions, of course. You can put questions in ahead of time if you want, and always order a signed copy at authorsvoice.net. You can do it here, too. If you think that Craig is a wonderful speaker, he's as good a writer. And you're going to just flow right through from Scapa Flow to the end
Scapa Flow.
in this particular book. If you're watching on YouTube after this broadcast, you can still order signed books, first editions, and add it to your library. Now, look, we didn't cover hardly anything in this as far as I'm concerned. I just circled a few of the things that I wanted to talk to you about we couldn't get to. Midway and Coral Sea. Why June 1944 was so decisive. What happens at war ends with the new German subs that came out? Could that have made a difference? Maybe so. The Archerfish is a fabulous story as well. We didn't talk about why the Pacific War from the American side was to attack the Japanese where they ain't. So you might want to read about why that's the case. Leyte and Sicily as a combination you speak about. Iwo Jima, Tarawa. We didn't get to all of this. Savo Island and Cape Esperance. So there's so much in this book that could still be reread, and I think you should. So I want to thank Craig Symonds with his book, World War II at Sea, A Global History with a Great Dust Jacket. I really enjoy this. Thank you, Oxford, for sending him to us to be here today. We thank all of you in Webland to be with us. Order a book right now, and we'll get it right out to you by mail. And the staff at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for Author's Voice, thank you so much. We couldn't have a show without them. Come back again, and I hope you'll enjoy this book when you get to it. Thank you.